But more largely, what we're going to see in the United States in the next 20 or 30 years, American Muslims are going to go the way of Catholics. In the 1800s, there were Italian Catholic churches, and German Catholic churches, and Irish Catholic churches. And those communities didn't really mix. And today, you're really basically just Catholic. If you're Irish or Italian, it might be important to you, but it's really not going to determine that much in terms of where you go to worship in most of America. The influx of Latinos is obviously changing things because they are, for many parts of America, a new population. But that's what I'm going to argue is going to happen to American Muslims. You're going to see more and more intermarriage across ethnic lines, and you're going to see Islam become something like an ethnic identity. Now, there are some Muslims who don't like this concept because, as I started in the beginning, Islam is a religion, it's not an ethnicity. But the fact of the matter is that in America, we tend to categorize people by ethnicity. And this is just the way in which we conceive of groups and populations. So the Jewish community, which is incredibly ethnically diverse, is treated as an ethnicity. And this is what's happening to Islam. And as an example of this, if you go to the airport and you get stopped, you are not stopped based on your level of religiosity. You are stopped based on your name. Your Islam has been made into an ethnic category, right? Muslims are being racialized. You can't opt out of it. So I have friends who have, long beards and they wear thobes and they just like fly through security. And I have Muslim friends who are now practicing who, no one would be able to say that this person's Muslim or not, and they get detained. And they're kind of like, really? Are you sure? What about that guy? And this is just something very interesting that's happening. It's the racialization of American Muslims. We are being turned into an ethnic category. And this is forcing all the little divisions within the American Muslim community to kind of come to terms with each other. Because again, we're talking about a population of 5 million people that comes from dozens of countries, that follows a lot of different religious traditions and interpretations, and has created a massive amount of confusion. And a final few points. A lot of people always ask why the American Muslim community doesn't punch at its weight. If you look at Muslims individually, they tend to be pretty accomplished culturally, financially, academically, professionally. They're well situated, so on and so forth, but they don't make a collective impact. And one of the biggest problems is that Muslims are being shoved into each other's faces where they've never known the other existed before. I'll give you an example of this. Please don't be offended. If you've heard the story before, just laugh anyway. It'll make me feel better. In the 1990s, there were a series of wars in Eastern Europe, which resulted in ethnic cleansing of Muslims largely, but of other ethnic groups as well. And a number of churches and the mosque in our area of New England got together to help bring Muslim refugees from Albania and Bosnia over into the United States and to resettle them. So in a case of internal racism, to prove that everyone is actually racist, and especially Muslims, my mosque, which was largely Arab and Pakistani, brought over the newly arrived Albanian Muslims, put them in the same room as the Bosnian Muslims, and then looked at each other and said, why aren't they talking to each other? A little bit like, don't add defense. But, it's like they speak different languages, and they're like, but they're right. They look the same. Like we all look the same too. But, that's just to prove that, at the end of the day, we're all a little bit retarded. But the second example of this, which I think is really interesting, is that we sponsored a family, and they had 11 children. My God. And I can't even imagine that, really. Wow. And the 3 youngest children were the first to come over. And the youngest of them was a boy who was about 4 or 5 years old, and being 4 or 5 years old, very precocious, he picked up English like nobody's business, and he was fluent in English within just a few months. It was remarkable. He just watched TV and talked to people, and by the time he was in the US for like half a year, you couldn't tell that he wasn't an American kid. He didn't even have an accent. And I remember taking him to the mosque for Friday prayers, which is the main day of the Muslim service of the week. And we got to the mosque a little early, and he's like a little guy, and he sat next to me. And one of my good friends, who's a big African-American Muslim guy, he's about like 6'8", like large man, comes and sits down. So it's like me, little white boy, big black man, right? And this little kid turns and looks at me and goes, like that, right? And I was like, oh God, this is not going to end well. And he looks at me and he's like, there's black Muslims. I was like, what is wrong with you? And he was floored. Because he came from a part of the world where everyone who was Muslim had blonde hair and blue eyes. And it had never, I don't think he knew what to make of us. When we told him we were from India, he was just like, Turkey? He's like, is that in Turkey? I'm like, yes, it's in Turkey. So is Mecca. He's like, oh, okay. And that was those were his horizons as a Muslim. He grew up in a place where everyone followed a similar school of thought in Islam, a similar religious tradition. Islam was organized by the state in many cases because they were majority Muslim populations. They were European, fully and entirely. They were ethnically Slavic. They had been Muslim for as long as many South Asians have been Muslim. So they've been part of the sort of larger Muslim world as long as many of these older populations that we think of as like the real Muslims, right? And he had never seen a black Muslim before. It didn't even compute to him. In the same way that brown Muslims get embarrassingly excited when they meet a white Muslim, right? They're like, oh my God, right? Like, it's the coolest thing in the world, right? It's like, wow, really? Are you sure? And it's just one of those things. And if you think about this on a larger scale, what we've seen in the last few decades is that you have populations that have never experienced alternative interpretations or practices of Islam who are kind of forced into each other. We're talking about a global religion that has developed over 14 centuries, that has included dozens of different states and political systems and economic systems and just ways of life, from merchants and farmers to nomads to industrialized cities to huge empires to very fringe societies and pastoralists, everything you can imagine. And now these huge populations are showing up in the United States. They're looking at each other and they're thinking, why are you doing that? That's not Islam. And the person's thinking, I've been doing this for 200 years. What you're doing is not Islam. And this, to a large extent, explains a lot of the fractures and weaknesses in the American Muslim community. Because American Islam is really figuring itself out and developing its own identity right now. But the problem is that in the process of developing that identity, we're also facing the fact that everybody's kind of looking in and saying, why haven't you done this or that? And this is really, I think, the great challenge of American Islam and where American Islam is going to go. But as a final point, and then I'll open it up to Q&A because I don't want to take too long, I told you that in the 1950s and 60s, Islam was associated with the civil rights movement. And in the last 10 or 15 years, Islam has been associated, unfortunately, and regrettably, but understandably, in many people's minds as a religion of violence and extremism. And yet, in the last 4 or 5 months, we have seen a completely different image of what constitutes Islam and what constitutes Arabness and Muslimness, and what the reality of the Muslim majority world is. And this just goes to show you that images of populations change all the time. I have a lot of people come up to me who have no exposure to Islam or Muslims who say, I see people who are Arab or Muslim out in the streets fighting for their freedom. I didn't know that that was what it was like over there, and I feel inspired. I feel a sense of optimism and hope that I haven't felt in a long time, or maybe ever really felt, because there are also a lot of people who didn't really remember 1991 and the fall of communism. And for them, this is their great democratic moment. And it's happening in a place where people speak Arabic and largely practice the Islamic faith. And that's something to think about, because images change very quickly and very easily, and we don't often realize that. And it's easy for people to fall into this victim narrative that we are picked on for some existential reason, we've always been picked on, and we're always going to be picked on, and there's no way to change that. But we saw people go out into the streets in the last few months, literally on nothing more than frustration, and stand up to incredibly brutal regimes at the risk of their lives, many of them giving their lives, and came in such huge numbers as basically a human wave, and radically rechanged the map of the world. And that's people power. And in the long term, that's the trajectory of the wider Muslim world, and that's something that American Muslims are going to be a part of. For a long time, Muslims around the world have looked to governments or individual leaders or political parties to get them somehow out of their negative situation into a better world. And for the first time, we are seeing the birth of a mass Muslim street politics. I want you to think about that. This has never happened before. It is the democratization of Muslim identity. And nobody knows where it's going because it's never happened before. But people have finally woke up to their strength in numbers and said to themselves, if there's so many of us, why don't we make an impact in the world? Why are we only, if ever, thought of negatively? And that spirit and that energy is going to radically change how people think of Muslims in this country as well. Because the negative associations that people have had of Islam are now challenged on a scale that you can't deny. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you. Yeah, so if there's I don't know how you want to do it.
If anyone has any questions, please just raise your hand.
You can ask anything. Or nothing. Just two.
Hello, I know you spoke a lot about American society, but are you knowledgeable on with the European issues with rejecting multiculturalism and kind of blaming it on people of Islamic faith? Do you know exactly what the people there can do about it?
I'm knowledgeable about everything. No, I'm not. The question was on European Muslims. It's pretty bad right now for European Muslims in a lot of ways. For those of you who don't know, I think the closest example is European Muslims are the Hispanics of Europe. They come from countries right south of the border of Europe. They come in large numbers. They tend to compose the working class. They're growing very quickly, and by 2030, they should be about 10 to 11% of the populations of most Western European countries. Doesn't mean they're going to take over, like some of those YouTube videos allege, that somehow they will all have 100 children. This is somehow feasible, right? And flood and erase Western Europe in history. But they are growing faster, and although their populations are slowing down over time and their growth rate, they're growing faster than the Western European population right now. So there's a lot of anxiety. There's two ways to look at it. One way to look at it is to say that America had a minority population and we went through the civil rights era. Europe had a minority population and they went through the Holocaust. We figured out a way to deal with our minority populations and our challenges in terms of civil rights. Europe had a much uglier experience with its biggest minority population, which was the Jewish population. I mean, the biggest population across Europe, Western and Eastern Europe, especially Eastern Europe, were Jewish. That's no longer the case because most of them were slaughtered. And that's indicative, I think, of an unfortunate legacy that has basically, been re-energized. And I don't think anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Europe are really different things. In a lot of ways, it's the same thing all over again. The same things people said about Jews in the 30s and 40s. You can't make them German. They're not. You'll never change them. It's in their blood. They're religion. They're not an ethnicity. They have too many kids. They're uncouth and dirty. They practice weird religious traditions. Look at how they cover their head. I mean, they slaughter their meat in public places. I mean, the exact same things are being repeated all over again. That's one way to look at it. And with that, you could look at Bosnia, right? People forget that the last ethnic cleansing in Europe happened 15 years ago. That's not a long time ago. And tens of thousands of people, largely Muslim, were killed. Thousands of women were raped, and it was on the issue of religion. On the other hand, up until World War II, Europe was an incredibly diverse place. And the fact is that World War II led to this massive ethnic cleansing. So one way of thinking of it, there's more Muslims in Spain than Protestants. Wow. There's more Muslims in Sweden than Catholics. Like, Europe became so homogenized after World War II and all those forced population movements that they've lived for 50 or 60 years in these bubbles that are not even consistent with European history. I mean, look at 1900s like Vienna and the Austro-Hungarian